Hello, everybody, and welcome to our 6th annual Judy Marcovitch lecture series. I want to welcome our speaker, Dr. Laurie Lefkovitz, and our sponsor, Bob Marcovitch. And I would like to, before I tell you about the two of them, just tell you a little bit about Judy Marcovitch, who was one of our early residents at Newbridge and was a most beloved member of our community. I could talk a lot about her, but I'm not going to say a lot other than that she was someone who was a lifelong learner who just really enjoyed learning about everything, in particular things Jewish, things to do with art and culture, and she had a wide range of interests, and in addition to her intellectual strengths, was really a wonderful, warm, and good friend to many people who were here and who knew her. Her son, Bob Marcovitch, and his wife, Elise Eplin, have made a contribution for an annual lecture for her, and I'll tell you just a little bit about Bob, who is here with us. You want to stand up, Bob? So Bob is the son of Jack and Judy Marcovitch, and Jack died 10 years ago, and Judy died 6 years ago. Bob went to school in Newton South High School graduate. He is a lawyer practicing, he's a practicing appellate attorney for the past 36 years, and he also teaches as a visiting professor of practice at Emory University School of Law. And he's been married for a long time to Elise Eplin, and they live in Atlanta, Georgia. But in the summer, they come to Maine, where Elise and Bob both can work for several months over the summer, and Bob is here today from Maine. They have 2 adult children, and that's the summary of Bob, but there's lots more, and feel free to come over and say hi to him afterwards. I'm going to read you an abbreviated version of a bio about our speaker, Laurie Hope Lefkovitz, and let you know just a small amount of her accomplishments. She is the Ruderman Chair in Jewish Studies at Northeastern University, where she directs the Jewish Studies program and is a professor of English. For 9 years, she served as director of the Northeastern University Humanities Center. Her book, In Scripture, The First Stories of Jewish Sexual Identities, was a finalist for the National Book Award in the Women's Studies category. She's a graduate of Brandeis University and received her PhD in English from Brown University and was a recipient of a Woodrow Wilson Dissertation Fellowship in Women's Studies at the Golda Meir Postdoctoral Fellowship at Hebrew University and a postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute of the Philadelphia Association for Psychoanalysis. She's a senior Fulbright professor at Hebrew University in Jerusalem and an honorary doctorate from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and was the founding director of Kolot, the Center for Jewish Women's and Gender Studies at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. I'm cutting out a lot. She is widely published in the fields of literature, critical theory, and Jewish women's studies, and has written several other books. And under her direction, Kolot was developed, which is a program at the Rabbinical College, and she also innovated the amazing website ritualwell.org, which has great, interesting, creative, liberal Jewish initiatives in it. And she is married to Rabbi Lenny Gordon and is the parent of 2 grown daughters. Without further ado, Dr. Laurie Lefkovitz.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be back here, and I'm so pleased to see a full room. My mother used to say, just talk about sex and they'll come. We have a missing phone.
A found phone.
Found phone.
Let me just add one thing.
Sure.
Before we go forward, I'd like to remind you to please switch the ringer off your phone. Thank you.
The phone reminded you about the phones.
Thank you.
So it's really very wonderful to be back here again at Newbridge. I don't think I've been here since before COVID, and I see some familiar faces in the room. This is one of my favorite learning communities, and I'm honored to be delivering once more the lecture in memory of Judy Marcovitch, herself, as we just heard, a lifelong learner, and I want to express my gratitude to her family for sustaining a lectureship. It's really a gift to a community to have ongoing, supported learning. May her memory, may the memory of both of your parents continue to be a blessing. I also want to thank Judy Ehrlich for that lovely introduction, if a little over the top, to whom I'm grateful for this invitation. And she actually suggested today's topic when she saw that I had recently offered an undergraduate course at Northeastern on sex, gender, and Judaism. That was a new course for me. I had never taught it before, and it got a pretty strong enrollment among students whom I'd never seen in Jewish studies classes before. So, and it was a surprisingly varied student body. So maybe at the end we can talk a little bit about that, because there's a shift in the wind, and this topic, the intersection of sex, gender, and Judaism, or sex, gender, and anything, is inspiring a lot of curiosity because we're in all kinds of transitions. So I think Judy suspected that this topic would be of interest to you, not because the intersection of Judaism, sex, and gender is novel. Jewish stories and Jewish law have always had a lot to say about sex and about gender roles. But feminism, LGBTQI plus activism, transgender and non-binary identities have actually revolutionized our understanding of our bodies and our humanity in ways that have inspired equally radical interventions in Jewish scholarship and Jewish practice. So in our conversation today, and I'll make a presentation which I don't know how long it'll go, we'll see, but I hope to inspire conversation, and I also don't mind being interrupted. I've been at this for such a long time. So I hope we'll have some back and forth, and I just want to give you an overview, a sampling of what I did in that course of Judaism's treatment of human sexuality and gender roles, and some of the changes that have been wrought over time. So the Jewish body, the slide is Mila, Tahara, Mikvah, legislating sex. So from Genesis 17, this is my covenant with you and your descendants, which you are to keep. Every male among you must be circumcised. You are to circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and this will be a sign of the covenant between me and you, generation after generation. And it goes on. You, your family, the people who live in your house, whether they belong to you or not, everybody. So from birth through death, Judaism handles and manages our bodies. The commandment to circumcise engraves the covenant between God and the people of Israel on the flesh of 8-day-old baby boys, and it is one of the most observed of all Jewish ritual practices, even among the most secular Jews. Everybody seems to do this. Though recently, because we're talking about changes, with concerns about bodily integrity and the rights of minors and new ideas about what is and isn't healthy, the ritual is being challenged, especially on the West Coast. That's Mila, birth. So-called purity legislation regulates when men and women may have sexual relations after menstruation or seminal emissions. And the Talmud famously legislates how often, catch the phrasing here, a man is obligated to give his wife sex. That is, she wants it, he has to give it. And it's based on his profession. regularly, according to Exodus 21:10, but that regularity depended on what he does. So according to the Mishnah and Ketubot, healthy men of leisure are obligated to say yes if so requested every day. Laborers who work in their own town of residence, twice a week. Mule drivers who transport goods for short distances, once a week, and so on and so forth. I think Talmudists get a pretty good reprieve. And every Jewish teenager who went to Hebrew school knows that sex is a double mitzvah on Shabbos, when it is spiritualized by Jewish mysticism as mirroring and aiding in the union of God and the Shekhinah, the masculine and feminine aspects of the divine. So that's, birth, midlife. But the sanctity of the Jewish body is perhaps nowhere more evident than in the careful practice of tahara after death and before burial, a cleansing process by the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, that is considered one of the greatest of the mitzvot, the commandments. So mikveh is that practice around which, the middle part, the menstrual, the purity legislation, conversion, that's the regular purity practice legislated on the body. And when I was in my 20s, a long time ago, before even the conservative movement was ordaining women, and I was discovering one of my academic identities as a Jewish feminist, I wrote in my first major publication in Jewish women's studies that Jewish feminism will reclaim and transform Jewish rituals and liturgy to create a more egalitarian Judaism, which actually I think was pretty much right. But the only thing that I can never imagine being redeemed is the practice of mikveh, because the concept of menstrual impurity is so sexist and has had such detrimental impact on the perception of women that it's irredeemable. So some 30 years later, after we moved, before we even moved to Boston, when the feminist mikveh Mayim Chaim was celebrating a young anniversary, they invited me to give a talk at that celebration. And my opening sentence was that in the years since my 20s and that moment, what came parenthood, which taught me an important thing. Parenthood taught me to bless my words so that I could eat them. And I also said, in the same spirit of blessing my words so that I could eat them, no child of mine would ever play with Barbie dolls. We should actually honor Ruth Handler, who is one of the great Jewish women and who's very much in the news these days with the new movie. So what Anita Diamond really figured out is that the physical ritual of immersion has immense power to sanctify and give one a sense of rebirth. And Mayim Chaim, like ritualwell.org, which Judy mentioned, are among the feminist interventions in ritual that has thoroughly transformed the uses of mikveh and its connotations. Tahara at the end of life has raised perhaps a surprising Jewish legal question in our own generation. As you must know, there is a separate Chevra Kadisha for men and women. But which Chevra Kadisha do you use for Tahara if the person being buried began his life or their life as a girl, but ended their life as a man? Right now we have transgender identity is open. Does it matter if this person's body was or was not surgically altered? So the conservative movement has developed a beautiful, clear teshuvah response, it's about 30 pages, on this question, adjudicating, that is ultimately concluding, that what is relevant is how the deceased person understood him or herself in life. And that should be the overriding principle in determining how their body is treated in death. But how is this adjudicated in the cases of non-binary individuals who identify as neither male nor female? And that just presents special challenges. So just some of the thorny questions that we're on the cusp of. So everything has a history, even the human body. And we experience our own bodies, of course, naturally, but I would argue also culturally. In many ways, we know who we are. Our experience of our own bodies has everything to do with social messaging. So while we may think that the multiplicity of human bodies and human sexuality has a distinctively modern ring, and Professor Anne Fausto Sterling at Brown University really pioneered the idea that there are 5 sexes. She wrote a book about the 5 sexes. She has since concluded that there are more than 5 sexes, and she's a biologist. She means biologically and chemically. But long before that, the Talmud offers 8 gender designations, all of them listed on this slide, and I won't take the time to read them, but you should feel free to just look at it. The first 2 are the familiar ones, Nikeva, female, Zachar, male, but androgynos, tumtum, ilonit, various ideas. You know what, the slides are just designed to, give you a distraction. So I would just say I got these designations from myjewishlearning.com, which has a wonderful, wonderful essay on this subject. If you're interested, just go to the internet and look it up. But Sarah Lev, Max Strassfeld are among the contemporary Talmudists who've written books and have mined the sources to support our contemporary understandings of the range of human bodies and sexualities with the wisdom of Jewish thought. So this so-called revolution was anticipated in Judaism and was much ignored until recently when we've needed it, and a new brand of Talmudists has arisen, new scholarship, and they're finding what they need in the past. So anyone who's ever heard me teach will have heard this sentence because it's my refrain. What we know of the past, we don't know anything about the past. History is actually irrecoverable. What we do know has everything to do with who is holding the lantern and the direction in which the light is cast. Because we can't remember everything. We can only find what we think to look for. So this is a pretty interesting original source. My students were bug-eyed with it. Like, oh, really? They knew there was more than 2 genders? Yeah, they did. So I would argue, I'm going to fill up this slide. I was going to do magic, but, never mind. I would argue that Jewish feminism's most powerful contribution has been to Jewish scholarship, a reshaping of Jewish knowledge. The library of this new work in Jewish women's studies, Jewish feminism, sex, gender, sexuality is actually vast. And on this slide is just almost an arbitrary random sampling. But I'll read you a little bit about it so you have a sense of what's been happening in the last 50 years. As early as 1983, our own Susanna Heschel created an anthology of essays by Jewish feminists that raised many issues, perhaps the most memorably a debate between scholars about the relative importance of halakha, that is Jewish law, or theology. So some say Jews don't really have theology. It's the law that matters. And Judith Plaskow sort of famously said, no, actually, it's the theology that we need to address in order to move towards a more egalitarian future. That is, if God is a man with a white beard, where we need to redefine really rethink the grounding force of religious belief. In 2001, which is already a long time ago, Rabbi Danya Rutenberg, published Yentl's Revenge, a collection of essays on the next wave of Jewish feminism. And just the cover is provocative. You see with the Jewish star image. And the foreword was written by Susanna Heschel. I've included on this slide my own work on Hebrew Bible in Scripture, first stories of Jewish sexual identities, and I've taught several classes here on that subject, in which I argue that the Bible invented the 2-sex system that is in the Garden of Eden. Humanity is created, male and female created he them, and then you have the origins of the normative family as we have always regarded as kind of natural, but most families actually don't look like that. But the origin stories of a culture this is my argument. The origin stories of a culture wear ruts in the cultural psyche, and we start to take for granted what those stories presume about human existence, like that a family is a mother and father and children and a dog. We just got a puppy, and I haven't slept in a week. And it proves I'm insane, but never mind. So first, stories of Jewish sexual identities. So I argue that these foundation myths establish gender roles and stereotypes. And also on this slide is an example of one of many feminist Torah and Haftorah commentaries, some of which are, each chapter is written by a different, each chapter on each parsha, on each Haftorah, is written by a different rabbi who is a woman. So, once upon a time we were waiting for women rabbis, and now they're writing the books, the new commentaries that are revisions or adding something to the interpretation of the history of interpretation of Torah. I included up there The Flying Camel, which is a collection of essays on the experience of Jewish women of Middle Eastern and North African Jewish heritage, which is perhaps the most burgeoning area right now of study as we expand our appreciation of Judaism and the Jewish experience beyond the long time overemphasis on Ashkenazi Jews. And my own curriculum in directing Jewish studies is in conversation with Jewish studies programs around the country as everyone is trying to figure out how we need to expand our canon, our curriculum, what books are we supposed to add. So here's just a sample of one that focuses on the experience of Jewish women in that part of the world. And, this is a footnote, I didn't write this down, but among the things that I discovered in learning about North African Jewish communities is there are holidays that were celebrated, some of which are actually good feminist holidays that we need to import into our experience of Judaism. My favorite is called Chag HaBanot, the holiday for daughters, and it takes place on the Rosh Chodesh in the middle of Hanukkah. And it was widely observed in these North African communities, and they read the book of Judith. So you would read the book of Judith, who had forever been associated with the Hanukkah story for no good historical reason, but in folk culture, and it fell away, and now it's coming back, and I think we need to do that with great energy. We had visiting us this semester at Northeastern Penina Lahav, who's recently retired from the law school at Boston University, good friend, whose latest book, not a law book, but a new biography of Golda Meir. And she focused on her position as the only woman, often the only woman in the room, her path to power, and her expectations of her children, which, if you ask me, were unreasonable, her commitment to the advancement of women, which existed more in theory and less in practice. That is, she really believed in the advancement of women, but she never did it. When the Jewish Women's Archive was founded in 1996, another Boston project by Gail Reamer talked about it at an opening event I attended. She talked about how if you asked a young person to name a Jewish man they admired, they offered a range of answers, from King David to Sandy Koufax to Albert Einstein, in any one of a number of fields. And if you asked them to name a woman, they reliably named Golda Meir or their own grandmother. Right? So we really, and that insight was what led her to say we need to do more work on recovering the biographies of Jewish women. And that's really has been an enterprise of Jewish feminism, but women's studies in general, again, taking the lantern and casting in a direction so that we can see what women were doing, right? So JWA.org, including the Jewish Women's Encyclopedia, has brought to life the biographies of Jewish women, widely expanding our understanding of Jewish women's history and their roles in business, community life, and the family. And this semester, as part of this course, I took my students to the MFA, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. There's a Judaica curator there who's just fantastic. Her name is Simona Dinepi. And I don't know if this is public, but don't tell I told you, in case it's not. But there is going to be a dedicated Judaica gallery for 2 years, starting on Hanukkah this year, at the MFA, and Simona is pulling it together, and I've been part of a consulting group, and it's fantastic. So when I saw all the things that she had about Jewish women in history, these wonderful embroidered, I forgot what you call it. What do you call the thing that wraps the Torah binder? That's what we call it in English. The Torah binder. I mean, they would make them in honor of babies when they were born, and then they would gift them to the community. Just fabulous things. So she gave us a tour of Jewish women's crafts and art and showed us artifacts from some of the most prominent women in Jewish history, including one by, on my slide, Donna Gracia, who lived in the 16th century. Gracia was a philanthropist and one of the wealthiest women in Renaissance Europe. And her biography is scandalous and fabulous. So again, that's a reading assignment to learn about Donna Gracia. I included Glickel, whose memoirs have give us insight into Jewish life in the 17th century. She lived from 1646 to 1724, wrote massive memoir that was for her children, and this is now a basic primary source in Jewish studies courses. The little figure here is a portrait of Sarah Brandon from the 19th century, and the subject of a fascinating study by Laura Arnold Liebman, who wrote a book called Once We Were Slaves, on the Jews of color in the early Americas. And it includes, the story of, what's her name that I just said, Sarah Brandon, who began her life as a slave and ended her life as a wealthy Jewish woman. Because of where she and her family moved, there were Jewish slaveholders. They did have children with slaves. These multiracial children, in some cases, including in the case of Sarah Brandon, ended up inheriting their father's estates because they moved, in this case, to New York City. And she had a different identity from slave to wealthy Jewish woman. Her family, her existing descendants, didn't know anything about her history until Laura started doing this research. She was very nervous to share it with them, but they proved to be good liberals, and we're quite delighted. So, had I been thinking I should have put Ruth Handler up there, the inventor of Barbie, who named Barbie for her daughter, Barbara. And apparently in the movie, which I haven't seen yet, though I'm really looking forward to it, though I think now that I have a puppy, I'll never get out of the house again. There's a moment in the film when Barbie identifies herself as Barbara Handler, once she becomes a real girl. So I would say that the most powerful tool that we have that helps us reimagine sex, gender, and the human body, and arguably the most Jewish tool, is interpretation. The Jewish interpretive tradition, which is my own field of study, begins to recognize gender trouble in paradise. We always say, if you ask anybody, which of the two sexes is the sex that tempts? Everyone will say, women, yeah, of course. But we also know that while Eve may have tempted Adam, she is first tempted by a walking, talking, erect snake. So which of the sexes does the tempting? I just leave it to you. Which is the seducer? She is named the mother of all life as a punishment, but Adam is her mother, as she is born from his body. I could go on and on, but the point is that in the very foundation story in the Garden of Eden, the sexes won't settle down. Like the effort to divide the sexes by roles and identities and character endlessly defeats itself. So Midrash imagines, because there are two creation stories. You may remember in the first one, humanity is created and the whole long list of the animals and everything else, and then humanity, male and female, created he them. In the second creation story, which is actually older but comes in later, in chapter 3, you have the story of Adam being made from the dust and then Eve pulled from his rib. So we are not the first to notice that there are two creation stories. The rabbis of the Middle Ages noticed that too, and they concluded that Adam had a first wife. Her name was Lilith. And Lilith ran away from the Garden of Eden, nice as it was to be, have everything done for you, because she didn't want to obey Adam. She didn't want to be subservient. So as a result, the tradition quite demonized her for her chutzpah, identifying her with all evil. But Jewish feminism reclaimed her, and when the long-running Jewish feminist magazine was founded, they named it Lilith. So I just want to offer you the three images on the slide. The one on the bottom is a take from of course, the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's. The whole ceiling of the Sistine Chapel tells the story of, the Bible from beginning to end, or their end at any rate. And so you're supposed to read it as in motion, right? It's telling a story. And this is a small cut from the moment when Eve takes the apple from the snake. What I would ask you to notice, it might not be that visible on this slide, but again, Rabbi Google, just Google the image, there are lots of them. What is ambiguous to my eye is the sex of the snake. The body of that snake has some, despite its maybe being male, has some decidedly female features. But also, I'm going to say something that you'll never unsee. My students get annoyed with this when I offer them this, but the whole thing's in motion, right? This is before the fall. They're about to fall. What was Eve doing before she turned around and reached for the apple? Never mind. Okay, moving right along. So the image above it is a famous painting by Collier. It's an image of Lilith, and just to notice that in this case, Lilith and the snake are either one or at least in very close relationship. And just in terms of social coding, every image of Lilith I've ever seen, she has red hair. There's something about red hair that is sexy, demonic, fabulous. So there she is, being gorgeous. But also it's positive, negative, positive sex. And just to, in my Googling around, as I do, we get an image, a contemporary image of Eve and Lilith reimagined as lovers. And even though that's just probably new pop art, it's based on a tradition as early as the 1970s when Judith Plaskow, the only Jewish feminist theologian, I would argue, wrote a little midrash, a little story called The Coming of Lilith, in which Eve is terribly afraid because Adam told her that Lilith is just horrible and is going to steal her babies and is just, wicked. And Lilith tries to get into the garden again to, find some human community. And Eve catches a glimpse of her and says, oh my, she's a woman just like me. And at the end of the story, and God is a little fed up with Adam in this story also because Adam's become a little uppity. So, bossing Eve around. So at the end of the story, Eve and Lilith start chatting over tea. And they become friends, and they walk out of the garden together holding hands with Adam and God, both a little afraid. So you have that wonderful, early midrash about, it really, it's the 1970s, it's about sort of, I would argue, it was about how the generation of bra burners and early feminists and feminist activists were threatening to the previous generation of women, but how that next generation of women was starting to win over their mothers and grandmothers, and that let's just be in conversation about women's rights. And then so you have this flourishing of interpretations that takes itself all the way over to a reimagination of who Eve and Lilith could be to each other. So these fanciful interventions in Bible stories has wrested this foundation text from the limiting interpretations of medieval commentaries. And there are lots of them, I would say, including, in the Bible, Rachel and Leah, who, are sisters, the only emotion they feel for each other is envy. One wants the love, the other wants the children, and envy is an overriding emotion that women feel for each other in early texts. It's only in later texts that women find themselves, their relationships redeemed. But Leah and Rachel are redeemed as friends as early as Rabbinic Midrash. Leah is pious. Her sister helps her to fool Jacob. They're really in it together. The rabbis appreciated Leah as one of the matriarchs, and they didn't want to leave her in such a sorry state as the Bible does. And then later stories have even done more to intensify their relationship with each other. I'm not going to say too much about this, but it's at the core of my own work and my own book. It's a chapter that I called Bedrooms and Battlefields, a whole series of stories of women who, and they're women who seduce, but as I like to put it, instead of being penetrated, they penetrate with a vengeance. That is, they seduce men for one reason into another or another, generally because they're heroines and the men are evil, into the bedroom, and then instead of what the men expect, they cut their heads off. So this reversal of sexual power, the origin stories for the femme fatale, here's how I like to put it. In foundation stories, the bedroom is the battlefield where men always lose. Esther, Judith, Delilah, in this case, Yael. You have one image of Judith. These are both by Artemisia Gentileschi. They're representations of female physical power. It's immense, it's murderous. And what I would say about these stories is that they expose an underlying fear of female sexuality. Men may, feel powerful in the world or pretend to feel powerful in the world, but the little boy in them is afraid of, Rebecca in the kitchen and her authority over him. And in the bedroom, where they lose control, there's a kind of underlying terror of female sexuality that I would argue is a patriarchal anxiety that confines women to the tent and keeps them in the bedroom and out of the boardroom. So Gentileschi represents, I think, in a critical way, this kind of power. And I would argue that it's not an accident that in the top one, which is Judith beheading Holofernes, the enemy general, and this is why it's an origin story for Hanukkah. The tradition is that she ended the Maccabean revolt by killing this enemy general, by seducing him and then hoisting his head on a pole the next morning, and everybody thought the gods were against them and they fled. But for Gentileschi, I think it's not an accident that the story represents her working with her maid. And at the end of the story, she releases her maid. So this is all these commentaries, these paintings, these are old and classic. I'm not going to read you any of this, but I'm just alerting you to its existence. So the most extreme, I think, expression of Torah interpretation, commentary, playfulness, enhancing our inquiry into gender identity is a project called Torata. So before that, Helena Ayalon, who is no longer living but was a good friend of mine, she's an artist who famously, and you may have seen her work because it was in all the Jewish museums, she took the whole Torah and she covered it with a kind of laminate. And she used pink highlighter, not on the parchment, but on the laminate over it, to highlight in pink everything that offended her sensibilities. So if you were reading it, you could read for all the yucky parts. Torata has taken this a different in a different direction. Again, artist Yael Kanarak has written the whole, she's Israeli, so she did this in Hebrew, and now they're doing it in English. I think they're through Genesis and maybe Exodus. But she took the whole Torah and she rewrote it, every word, just reversing the genders. So God is Elohim, the serpent is a serpentist, everything that Adam does, Adam is a woman and has a different, name, maybe Adama, I don't remember what she does with the names, but she just reverses all the genders. So it's a kind of experiment to see what happens when you switch it. So the one thing I will tell you as a theorist is that there's no symmetry. A woman is not, it's not the same. A queen is not a female king, right? They're different. So by doing this, she exposes that lack of symmetry. So I'm gonna pick up the pace just a little here, and I want to give you one small example of the ways in which new biblical interpretations have affected and influenced and infiltrated Jewish practice. And I just will use the example of Miriam. I was looking at the word miracles. Miriam her name is Miriam. It has the word yam, which means sea and water, right? All of the miracles associated with the figure of Miriam are water miracles. She saves her baby brother in the Nile. After the liberation, she leads the women in song and dance with a timbrel. She's the leader of women after the parting of the waters. She has this confrontation with God, where at the end of which she gets leprosy. Moses says, Ana elna rafanala, God, please heal her. It's the first prayer for healing. We often sing it in shuls now. Ana elna rafanala, God, please heal her. It's a prayer for healing. The people won't go anywhere while she's quarantined and healing. They won't move without her. And when she dies, there's no more water, after which Moses strikes the rock and gets this very unreasonable punishment of not getting to go into the promised land. So one has the feeling that Miriam somehow has access to the divine water pipe. And we are not the first to notice this. Again, the rabbis noticed this, and in the Midrash and in the whole folk tradition, they created the idea of Miriam's well, that while the people in the desert, according to the Bible, are accompanied by fire and smoke to lead them in the day and the night because of Aaron and Moses, they're also accompanied by a well of water to slake their thirst while they're wandering in the desert, and that's because of the merit of Miriam. And they go further and they say that water was filled at creation with the waters of the firmament. And when she dies, the well disappears, and that's why Moses panics. But when they pray, the well comes back, and it's still following the Jewish people now. That's the myth of Miriam's well. So that's an old story, we didn't invent it. But Miriam's not the only woman carrying a timbrel in the Bible. Jephthah's daughter is carrying a timbrel to celebrate her father's victory, tragically. And every woman seems to, they're fleeing Egypt. The bread doesn't have enough time to rise, but every woman has what in her backpack? A tambourine. So it suggests that this was a woman's ritual object. Where did it go? So again, contemporary women are bringing back, that's a timbrel designed by Betsy Teutsch, Jewish Judaica artist. She's done many of them. The idea is to bring it back, to put it on your Seder table, right? So you can shake it to celebrate miracles. She's also, and the other thing that has, the practice that in many Jewish families at the Seder of adding a Miriam's cup filled with water, right, as analogous to Elijah's cup, which is filled with wine. And so, I have to remember still to put the Miriam's cup on the table. But my children, who are now, the older one is 35, they've never seen a Seder table without one. It's as unnatural not to have a Miriam's cup for them as it is for me not to have an Elijah's cup. And there's a song, Miriam HaNeviah. And many people now have a place for Miriam at a Simchat Bat because of Miriam at a baby naming for a girl. Because if Elijah is there for boys, Miriam should be there for girls. So Miriam has infiltrated herself into Jewish practice, especially with the ritual object of the Miriam's cup There is no Judaica store anywhere in America that doesn't sell Miriam's cups. And that's because Barbara Dopkin brilliantly, nothing like a good philanthropist, created a contest for artists for Miriam's cups. Then she created a traveling exhibition. Artists had made all these Miriam's cups. Then what did they do with them? They sell them, right? You know, you have to think like a capitalist. So and classical midrash understood that not only that Miriam was connected to the divine water pipe, but the idea was that women were especially pious because they had all their tambourines because they were expecting miracles. So the songs for healing in shul, the Miriam's cup of water at the Seder table, the reclamation of the timbrel as a ritual object are all innovations. And where there's ritual innovation, I didn't put my, oh, here, I do have it in front of me. There's also liturgical innovation. So if you have a Miriam's cup at your table, what do you say? What's the ritual? So here's a quick, I'll just read you Marge Piercy's poem. I love this. And then I'll start to wrap up. I see the hour. The cup of Elijah holds wine. The cup of Miriam holds water. Wine is more precious until you have no water. Water that flows in our veins, water that is the stuff of life, for we are made of breath and water, vision and fact. Elijah is the extraordinary. Miriam brings the daily wonders, the joy of a fresh morning, like a newly prepared table, the white linen cloth on which nothing has yet spilled, the descent into the heavy waters of sleep, healing us, the scent of fresh bread baking, roasting chicken, fresh herbs, the faces of friends across the table, what sustains us every morning, every evening, the common daily miracles, like the taste of cool water. So I would want to make the point here that Jewish feminism, here's a timbrel that Betsy made for Purim, so that it's designed to be every time, you use the grogger for Haman, every time there's Esther, you're supposed to have the pleasant sound of a Miriam's timbrel. So ritual and liturgy. The lulav and the etrog. So a story, an anthropologist goes into a community and sees a fertility ritual, American anthropologists, they think this is a true story, but it might be apocryphal or urban legend. And the women all have hoops, hula hoops kind of things, and the men all have spears, and the men toss the ritual or the dance is, they toss the spears through the hoops, and that's the fertility rite and celebration. And of course, the American anthropologist is like, oh, duh. Fertility, hoops, spears. And when he tells them his not interpretation, what he saw is obvious, they're like, oh, Americans have such dirty minds. They didn't see it that way. So the lulav and the etrog, they're long associated with the human body. And Sukkot is one of our fertility, our harvest festivals. The spine of the human body, and the etrog is connected to the womb, right? The heart and the womb. Yes, that's right. The heart, in the Talmud, they talk about the etrog as a heart and the other as a spine. We could see him the other way, but the etrog is also a rechem, a womb, and there was a folk custom that women were supposed to, after the holiday was over, if they were struggling with infertility, to put the etrog under their pillows. So yeah, these symbols, the symbols associated with the body, with fertility, with sex, are as old as the hills. But what I want to argue simply, or make the point, is that Jewish feminism in its innovations has changed Judaism. So the bris was usually, when I was a kid and you went to a bris, or even a young adult, it was like, get this ritual over with and let's eat the bagels. And then when the Simchat Bat was introduced for little girls, people worked hard to write beautiful new ceremonies and to explain the names. And so you had this beautiful ceremony for a baby daughter, and what did that do? It changed the bris. Now you had to do a beautiful ceremony for your son, and the bris became elevated. Feminist seders created innovations that people brought to their home seders and revitalized it. Women's interventions into ritual garb, like talitot and kippot, created these beautiful garments. It's no longer the black and white plain old thing that everybody's wearing. So it's not just for women. The Chanukiah on top is not new. It's in the Jewish Museum in New York. That's Judith up there. Many Chanukiot used to have Judith on as the decoration. She was the shamash because she was associated with Hanukkah. She disappeared. Now we have to bring her back, and we have to remember that this is the Chanukiah. Who do I have on the top there? Oh, that's just an image of a woman with a timbrel. And now I'm going to take you to the next development, which is the work of Tamar Paley, a jewelry artist and ritual object artist. This is her talit and tefillin. It is on display in the MFA. So, jewelry is, again, more innovation. And I'm going to end by just saying something about pushing the boundaries. These are tattoos. If there's anything, I know, I feel the way you feel about that, but tattoos are the most unlikely Jewish practice, right? I mean, and I think it's because of Auschwitz, we tattooing bodies. Then I was a little bit scandalized and surprised, and also I don't know what, because, you reach a certain age and you have to work harder to be where young people are. That young Israelis were tattooing their grandparents' numbers on their own arms. So, and then it reminded me that, like, the Hasidim wear garb that were forced upon them, and they took it and they transformed it into an identity thing. So, are you honoring your grandparents by wearing their number on your arm as a tattoo? I don't know what these grandparents thought, but one of my students, I would just say, like the transformation of Lilith and Vashti into heroines, tattoos, which are of the most unlikely Jewish practice, is now popular among some young Jews. And one of my students made a presentation about their tattoos and talked about how they brought them, and that's their pronoun, to their grandparents, and who were at first scandalized, and they brought them around to help their grandparents understand that these are expressions of their own commitment to Judaism. So sometimes it's even the forbidden that becomes sacred. So I'm going to conclude by saying that Judaism has always been complicit in the invention and reinvention of the Jewish body and gender roles as culture and societies evolve. It's always been adaptive through various forms of interpretation and stories and art. Today's vigorous engagements with sex and gender has led to the revitalization of some Jewish rituals, the elevation of Jewish women's history, the discovery of and promulgation of lesser-known texts about the sex body, like the Talmud's many sexes, to support Jewish inclusivity and welcoming of all Jews and Jewish communities. Judaism has become richer and more colorful. We see what has always been there with new eyes. We invent what we need in a Jewish idiom. When I began my work as a Jewish feminist, I longed someday to see women on the bima, women rabbis, benot mitzvah on Shabbos morning. We had ours on Friday night. I hoped that girls would be equal. Never could I have imagined how much has been accomplished in the liberal Jewish denominations. Neither could I have predicted the fear represented by the backlash that we are seeing everywhere today, not just in Jewish culture and Jewish community, and the extreme efforts to turn back the clock on inclusion and equality. So by focusing on some of what we see at the point of intersection of sex, gender, and Judaism, I hope that we also catch a glimpse of what may lie on the other side of the horizon. I thank you. Oops. Yes, I stay as long as you like, if you can still bear me.
First of all, thank you for making that hour pass very, very quickly. It was interesting and many things to ponder and things that seem obvious once you've said them, but not before you said them. And if anyone has any questions or comments that you'd like to have addressed, I'll come over to you and you can.
I'm just curious about something. When my great-grandson was named, it was a traditional naming, and my great-granddaughter was named last year, and it seems so different than it was years ago when my children were named. They talked about her background and everything. It was so different, and
It was
I thought
lovely,
it was
right?
beautiful, huh?
Exactly the point. And I think that that really the bris has been transformed because now families today can't imagine doing a lot of celebration, inviting friends, serving a meal for their sons and not their daughters. It just doesn't seem fair. So, but then you have to raise it to a level of sanctity. And when I went to the first of these Simchat Bats, were really when my own daughter was born about 36 years ago, or the few years before that, it was in New York, and I thought every Simchat Bat into all eternity is going to begin with the sentence, there is no canon for a Simchat Bat. Well, then we had our own daughter, and at the time we were living, I was teaching at Kenyon College in rural Ohio, and we had a Simchat Bat, and I invited everybody, the whole campus, we're naming, welcoming our daughter. To those people in rural Ohio on my campus, this was the first and only Jewish ritual they'd ever seen. And I realized it came down from Sinai. Nobody had any idea that this was a new Jewish ritual. And now I think it's really, there's a generation now that just doesn't know it ever was different. Oh, yeah, Barbara.
As a parent of one of those female rabbis,
Yes.
when she got married, she insisted that the ketubah be egalitarian. My sister-in-law did the calligraphy for this, and she swore up and down she would never, ever, ever make another egalitarian ketubah because everything for the man was there for the female.
So it's twice as long.
Oh, yeah.
There's a hand in the back. There's
One
a,
there, and then I'll come to you.
I think that's great.
So, getting back to the beginning when you were talking about Chevra Kadisha, I attended a conference on ritual in this new generation when you don't know what the story is. And one of the things that came out in that discussion was that if you walk into to do the tahara and you suddenly find the body is not what you expected, what do you do? And the conclusion from the group was, you're there to honor the person. You do what you came to do in a respectful manner.
Exactly what the tshuva also concluded. But what's important is, or interesting to me, is that, human bodies have been what they are forever, right? And, and what the Talmud indicates is that these ambiguities or changes are not new, but it's only today that we've reached a place because of scholarship, because of our own society, where the question is being asked so that rabbis can give the answer. And in fact, the tshuva says exactly that. The mitzvah, the principle, is to respect the body, which is a way of respecting the person, and you honor who they wanted to be. End of story, even as shocked as some of the people in the room may be. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Thank
Hi.
you so much. That's a lot to think about, and I
I
had
did the
no
whole
idea
course.
about any of this. When
I did the whole
ha-
course on one foot.
When I had my babies, which was many years ago, you said 20 years, but I'm a little bit older. I had
Talking to the microphone.
I had cesarean, and I was in the hospital, and they kept you in the hospital then for 9 days.
Wow.
And it was my son who was born, and he had to have a bris, and they wouldn't let me come. I was the mother. They wouldn't let me come at all. And I couldn't understand it, and other people did that as well. Because I'm a woman, I could never figure it out. But I think times have changed. And I think a lot of what you're talking about also is interpretation of things that were there before. The Talmud is written like that for us to be able to interpret at the time that we're reading
to
it.
continue the process of making Torah. And I think your point is very well taken, that, you know, your role as a mother was not respected because the idea of the bris was that the baby was now being brought into male community. It is not that way now, I think, even in religious communities. But I want to extend that example. I think one of the greatest impetuses for not the women's movement or feminism, but Jewish feminism, was when women were not able to say Kaddish when they lost a parent. Because not being included in the minyan and not being able to express their own position as mourners, as full human beings grieving, was a catalyst for a whole lot of intervention.
One last comment from Peter.
It's so nice to hear about people's experiences and to feel the way things have evolved in people's families.
I was curious about two things.
Yeah.
Number one, did this really, the idea of women's feminism and moving forward, become important when Sally Prizan was the rabbi, first female rabbi, or did it start before and she sort of brought it to light?
So there was actually a woman ordained in Germany that people don't even know about, but she was killed in the Holocaust, and now I am, much to my shame, because I don't remember any names anymore, I feel like a total noun aphasia, but she was ordained in Germany. So Sally Prizan was actually not even the first. But it's a chicken and egg question, because does society change and make it possible for Sally Prizan
To do it.
imagine doing it so that all the impetus, the groundwork is laid? Or do you have the great figure who is the pioneer who then, so when...
Well, didn't Mordecai Kaplan get involved with his
Well,
daughter?
Mordecai Kaplan was the first to have his daughter have a bat mitzvah
yeah.
in shul on Shabbat, and at SAJ in New York, and so. But you can only do what can be imagined. But he was one of the great figures who, I mean, he created the Jewish Center. He said every Jewish community should have a school, a shul, and a pool.
Yeah.
And, so this is a guy who really dreamed up, or what he understood was that Judaism was a civilization, not
Did you have a
religion.
conversation with Anita regarding the mikvahs at all at that time?
So yes, at the time I was the director of Kolot, and she was invited as a speaker at one of our fundraisers, the great Anita Diamond, because she had written The Red Tent. So we wanted her to talk about the Red Tent. She comes up there, does not talk about the Red Tent. She gives a talk about redeeming mikvah. And we're like, mikvah? Are you kidding? But another prescient figure, they said of the Red Tent that it was, the best-selling Bible commentary since the Bible. And, she denies that it's a Bible commentary. She says it's a novel. She doesn't want to be, overstate her claims to. But for my students, that novel allows them to imagine that the women characters in the sacred text had lives, had relationships, were in, we're human, exactly. We're something other than, the matriarch, the seductress.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's really fun to be here.
And thank you again, Bob, for enabling this very special opportunity.